Thank you for joining us this morning for the 34th Annual Humanities Day at the University of Chicago. I'm Martha Roth, Dean of the Division of the Humanities, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our campus. Each year, we showcase the innovative, foundational, and inspiring work of our faculty through this series of presentations, seminars, open houses, and tours. And I'm grateful to you, our dedicated supporters, friends of the university, and advocates for the humanities, for your essential role in this endeavor. I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Richard Stryer, the Frank L. Sulzberger Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of English, Language, and Literature and the college. After earning his BA from City College of New York, and his master's and doctorate from Harvard University, Richard has been a member of our community of scholars here at the university since 1973. He is currently the editor of the journal Modern Philology and sits on the editorial boards of the George Herbert Journal and A Graven Images, a journal of law, culture, and the sacred. He serves on the advisory board of the First Folio Theater at the Mays Lake Estate in Oak Brook, which stages Shakespeare plays and other classics. In his research and teaching, Richard finds common ground between two schools of thought, sometimes seen as mutually exclusive: formalism, in which texts are analyzed solely on the basis of their inherent attributes, and historicism, which situates literature within the context of its production and reception in time and space. Richard examines the ways in which American and English literature of the early modern era, roughly 1500 to 1800, engage with the expressions of theological and political philosophies of the time. He is the author of several books, the most recent of which, The Unrepentant Renaissance, From Petrarch to Shakespeare to Milton, won the 2011 Warren Brooks Award for Literary Criticism. He has edited numerous critical editions and collections, including the forthcoming Shakespeare and the Law, a conversation among disciplines and professions, which he is co-editing in collaboration with University of Chicago colleagues Braden Cormack and Martha Nussbaum. His current project is an annotated edition of King Lear that will use the text of the original recovered folios. Richard's classes cover a range of topics in addition to Shakespeare, including poetry, most notably the work of John Donne, metaphysical and religious topics in literature, early modern philosophy, the Renaissance, and criticism, from Plato to T.S. Eliot. In the classroom, as in his scholarship, Richard Stryer draws on his diverse expertise in order to provide students with new insights on some of the most studied works in the English literature canon. Visitors to Humanities Day in 2009 had the opportunity to enjoy his presentation on how to read a hard poem, in which he introduced participants to a poem by the American poet Hart Crane, which appears unintelligible to many upon first read, and Richard demonstrated how close, attentive reading opens the poem to a discerning audience. Richard's multifaceted approach to literary criticism, navigating apparently incompatible theories and examining works across a wide historical spectrum, will be on full display with today's keynote address, in which he will examine some of Shakespeare's most loved and best-known plays while acknowledging their discord with contemporary ideas. A recent review of The Unrepentant Renaissance in the Times Literary Supplement concluded as follows, and I quote, "Readers will want to accompany Stryer on this surprising and exciting journey to a strangely modern, freewheeling, worldly, pleasure-loving, and essentially happy Renaissance." End quote. It is my pleasure to invite you, this audience, to accompany Richard Stryer on such a journey this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to welcome Richard Stryer.
Shakespeare's Prejudices, Shrews and Jews. Early in the 20th century, George Bernard Shaw published a collection of his work with the somewhat facetious title, Plays, Pleasant and Unpleasant. The two plays that I'm going to discuss this morning, The Taming of the Shrew and The Merchant of Venice, which certainly fall into Shaw's second category. Although they've both been regularly and successfully produced, since the 18th century, they are both plays to which many people have strong negative reactions, women and feminists in general to Taming, and Jews and others to Merchant. My talk today is not intended to make such reactions impossible or even inappropriate. What I aim to do is to mitigate such reactions through a combination of close attention to the texts and the introduction of some historical and cultural context. I hope that the plays will look somewhat different after this talk, and that the obvious judgments upon them, one for misogyny, the other for anti-Semitism, will at least be somewhat more difficult to make, or will have to be made in much more complex and mitigated forms. I cannot promise, however, that these shadows will disappear from our pictures of these plays, nor, I should add, do I think that they should entirely do so. The Taming of the Shrew begins in a quite remarkable way, with a frame story that is a well-known folktale motif, sometimes called The Man Who Thinks He's Been in Heaven, a story found throughout Europe and in the Arabian Nights. The basic idea is always the same. A poor person is found asleep and then awakened in a setting of luxury, where he is told he has always been. Shakespeare said it in his own Warwickshire, and the poor person in question is a tinker named Christopher Sly. What Shakespeare saw in this famous story is made very clear by the aristocratic lord in this version. In setting up the trick and utilizing all his resources to do so, the Lord asks this question: when the poor man awakes in the lap of luxury, quote, would not the beggar then forget himself? So the question is one about the malleability of identity. Can someone be radically and fundamentally transformed by being treated radically differently? One can see, when the question is put this way, why Shakespeare associated that story with the various stories, also widely disseminated, concerning the taming of a shrew. The Lord, in the induction, as we've come to call it, is certain that the experiment will work. Having transported Sly to the Lord's, quote, fairest chamber, and providing all his senses with unaccustomed luxuries, the Lord is assured that Sly shall think he is no less than what we say he is. But does the experiment succeed? When Sly wakes up, he calls for a pot of small ale, a suitably cheap and unassuming drink. He is corrected by a servant who offers him instead a cup of sack, a very upper-class drink. Sly doesn't want it and seems content with his modest and worse than modest lot. The Lord and the servants tell him that he has been mad and his life as Sly was a delusion. It looks, after a while, as if they have succeeded. He wonders, do I dream, or have I dreamed till now? He realizes that he's not currently dreaming and attends to his senses. Upon my life, he says, I am a lord indeed. This is all very well, but this speech ends with him calling for, once again, a pot of the smallest ale. Finally, when, as part of his life of luxury, Sly is to be shown a play, he's not sure how to react. He is told that the thing he is about to see is, quote, a comedy, a term from classical literary criticism. He's prepared to watch this unaccustomed thing, which he's told is a kind of history, and greets it with some village proverbs. It looks very much like Christopher Sly, dressed up like a lord. But this is not all that the induction does. As we've just seen, it marks what we think of as the play, the taming and wooing stories, as a play. But there is a further point, in this case, to such meta-theatrical awareness. Part of the paraphernalia used to convince Sly of his real status is a wife. The person who will play this part is, we are explicitly told, a young boy. Bartlemy, my page, says the Lord. And this boy is given very detailed instructions. See him dressed in all suits like a lady, and bear himself such as he hath observed in noble ladies. What is especially stressed in how Bartlemy as noble lady should act is the performance of hierarchical subordination. Such duty to the drunkard let him do, with soft, low tongue and lowly courtesy, and say, "What is it your honor will command, wherein your lady and your humble wife may show her duty and make known her love?" So the performance of wifely subservience, as we first encounter it in the play, is exactly and literally that, a performance. This would be enough to lead us to consider gender as something that needs to be, or at least can be, performed. But there's a further dimension to it. By calling attention to the role of the wife in the induction being played by a boy, Shakespeare is forcing his audience to be aware of something that they would normally accept as a convention and give no thought to, that in the kind of a history that constitutes the play that they are watching, the existence of women is literally performed, since all the female parts are played by persons exactly like Bartlemy. The play as such gets going with another frame. Lucentio, the son of a successful businessman, has come from Pisa with his trusty servant to attend the famous university at Padua. But of course, he'll do nothing of the sort. His attention is arrested by something that looks like a show to welcome us to town, and that is the situation of a wealthy Paduan father with 2 daughters, the younger of whom has 2 suitors on hand, but whom the father will not allow to marry until the elder does so. This seems quite proper on the father's part, and he invites the suitors to shift their affections. The plot thickens, or begins, when one of the suitors roundly rejects this idea, and where the father had said, "court her," suggests that he would rather cart her, the punishment for whores, and states that the elder daughter is, quote, "too rough for me." At this point, this daughter speaks up, and we hear Katharina's first words. They are dignified ones. She turns to her father and asks whether he means to set her up for verbal abuse, since the father knows that the suitors are for the other. "I pray you, sir, is it your will to make a stale of me among your mates?" Meanwhile, we are introduced to the younger daughter, Bianca, as well. She's initially associated with silence rather than speech, and the Pisan would-be scholar is smitten with what he thinks he sees in this. After noting the elder sister's volubility, this young man says, "In the other's silence do I see maid's mild behavior and sobriety." So the question immediately arises as to whether this interpretation of the younger's silence is correct, and whether this appearance of traditional womanly, quote, behavior corresponds to anything. Bianca then does speak, ostentatiously performing obedience. "Sir, to your pleasure, humbly I subscribe." The father, Baptista Minola, then makes clear that he is unusual in seriously concerning himself with and being willing to spend real money on the education of his female children, who of course will require private tutors, since they cannot, like the Pisan would-be student, go to the university. At this point, the history is set up. We will watch Bianca being wooed by suitors pretending to be tutors. This is the 3rd plot strand with which Shakespeare is working. And we'll watch a suitor being found to woo and wed Katharina, quote, "with all her faults, and money enough." Before we get to Petruchio, who will be introduced in the next scene, I should say a word about how the disguised suitor plot fits in with the other strands, the induction and the shrew story. One might think that a plot of disguising would be quite different from a plot of potential identity transformation. But in this story, when Lucentio decides to disguise himself as a humanistic tutor to the girls, claiming to teach, it should be noted, not only Latin but Greek, a very unusual attainment even for males, his servant, Tranio, assumes Lucentio's role as rich young visitor setting up a household. And like Bartlemy, Tranio is given very specific instructions and accoutrements, especially clothing, with which to play this part. Lucentio tells him, "Keep house and port and servants, as I should," and Tranio promises to be, quote, "obedient." So aristocratic identity is presented as potentially a matter of performance, and again, obedience is ironized. The long scene that constitutes the play's second act is the pivotal one in the play. It begins by giving us Katharina and Bianca again, with Katharina very interested in Bianca's feelings toward her suitors, and with Bianca smarmily virtuous. "I know my duty to my elders," she tells her older sister. Katharina acts shockingly. She strikes Bianca and refuses to be pacified by their father, insisting that Bianca's feminine behavior, quietly weeping, is a form of passive aggression. "Her silence flouts me," she says. Whatever we think about Bianca here, Shakespeare has upped the ante on Katharina's bad behavior. From rudeness to those who are mocking her to needless physical violence. But we also learn in this episode that Katharina truly does want to get married, and that this is what lies behind her behavior here. She's angry with her father for, as she thinks, favoring Bianca and not really caring about her own marriage prospects. She is your treasure. She must have a husband. But it turns out, interestingly, that Katharina is wrong about this. When Petruchio presents himself as indeed a suitor to Katharina, a remarkable bit of dialogue ensues. After assuring Baptista about his background and his financial stability, Petruchio inquires about the size of Katharina's dowry, and in turn assures her widowhood. He does mention getting her love, but seems mainly concerned with getting the financial arrangements firmly in place. He says, "Let specialties be therefore drawn between us, that covenants may be kept on either side." But Baptista shifts the focus from the monetary to the emotional. In response to Petruchio's insistence on specialties, detailed contracts, Baptista says that he will act when that special thing is well obtained, that is, her love, for that is all in all. So the terms are now clear. Petruchio must do more than come to terms with Katharina's father. He must obtain that special thing. So how does he do that? The wooing scene consists of a battle of wits, and Shakespeare's audience, like that of modern sitcoms, knew that that meant that the end was foreordained. A wit battle between the sexes, however apparently hostile, was clearly recognized as a form of flirting. The one between Katharina and Petruchio builds to a spectacular dirty joke. Petruchio's vision of, as he says to her, "my tongue in your tail." But it is Katharina who set this up. She is the one who insisted on discussing where a wasp wears its sting. But meanwhile, as part of this interaction, Katharina has, now for the second time that we have seen, been physically violent. She strikes him. Petruchio puts up with it, only this time, he assures her, and goes on with the verbal play. At the end of this interaction, he tells her that he has her father's consent, has arranged the dowry, and will marry her. Will you, nill you? But the Elizabethans knew that this was not possible. The woman's consent, at least formally, was legally required of a marriage. When Baptista and others come back onto stage, Petruchio tells Katharina, never make denial. He must and will have her to wife. And Katharina does not, in fact, make denial. This is truly a case where silence implies consent. Her silence is so marked a feature of the moment, that her father comments on it. She then calls Petruchio a madcap ruffian, not exactly devastating, and Petruchio claims that it is agreed between them that she shall still act shrew-ishly in public, while privately they have agreed to wed. She does not protest this. When he says, "Give me your hand, Kate," she presumably does. When he reiterates that the date of the wedding has been set and announces that he is going off to Venice to buy proper wedding clothing for both of them, Katharina remains silent. Baptista says, "Give me your hands," which again, presumably they do, in a gesture that had virtually legal force. Before I go on to discuss the wedding itself and the scenes of Petruchio's estate, I want to point out one more episode in this scene, which is the longest in the play. Now that Katharina is taken care of, Bianca can be married. Here is how Baptista addresses himself to two of Bianca's apparent suitors. "He of both that can assure my daughter greatest dower, shall have Bianca's love." Bianca is raffled off, and we see this raffle taking place, and she's not even present. Her consent, apparently, is assumed. She is, after all, the obedient daughter. This is, of course, not what ensues, but the contrast between how Baptista treats the two daughters is striking. Daughterly obedience, if it actually existed, looks like it would produce a highly unappealing result. As to the wedding ceremony, not dramatized, Petruchio rides in on, we are told, a spectacularly diseased horse and dresses so badly that Baptista says it is a shame to your estate, and Tranio, pretending to be a fellow gentleman, calls him unlike yourself. But Petruchio is the spokesman in the play for the independence of identity from social accoutrement, especially clothing, an especially important marker of status for the Elizabethans. He insists that his clothing is irrelevant, and he breaks decorum in every way. Katharina resists such treatment, and at this point, Petruchio utters one of his two most controversial and, it seems, odious speeches. He insists that he owns Katharina. She is my goods, my chattels. She is my house, my horse, my ox, my ass, my anything. And he threatens action against anyone who tries to gainsay him, that is, legal action. But even before we get to the deflating pun on action, it is impossible to take this speech seriously. The status of a married woman was indeed dubious in law, but she was not a piece of property, and Petruchio makes his claim in a way that has to be seen as exaggerated and comic. She is my house, my horse, my ox. The claim to absolute possession undercuts itself here, and the audience would recognize that this is Petruchio acting as a kind of fool, a madcap ruffian, not a sober householder. But again, Catherine does go off with him. Petruchio's homestead is often presented in productions as a kind of dump, and his servants as ragged. This is surely not intended to be the case. In finding fault with his servants, as in finding fault with the food being served, Petruchio is again acting. He is apparently employing the theory of homeopathy, of curing like with like, being, as his head servant says, more shrew than Katharina. But this is not his account of his behavior. He provides this in the only soliloquy in the play, the speech that begins, "Thus have I politically begun my reign," where he goes on to make the famous analogy between how he is treating Katharina and how a falcon is to be trained. He says, "My falcon now is sharp and passing empty. Until she stoop, she shall not be full gorged." He then notes, "Another way I have to man my haggard," which is to keep her from sleeping. This is his special method for taming a shrew. Can anything positive be said about this? I'm afraid that this is where some contextualization is required. First, we must know a little more about, let's call them normal, methods of shrew taming, ones that appear in the popular shrew taming materials. The falconry analogy is unique. The normal way of taming a shrew is through physical violence. In one merry jest, in the form of a ballad printed around 1550, the shrewer's wife is cured by being beaten bloody and then, while her wounds are raw, wrapped up and hung up in the salted skin of an old, sick horse. That does the trick nicely. One of the striking features about Petruchio's treatment of Katharina is the lack of striking. He never hits her. This is a major departure from the tradition, such as it is, of shrew taming. When the prospect of Petruchio wooing the elder daughter was first being discussed, Petruchio's servant warned that she'd better watch out, because Petruchio will rail in his rope tricks and will, quote, throw a figure in her face, and so disfigure her. This is a picture of rhetoric as violence. But the point is that it is not real violence. A figure of speech, unlike a whip, will only disfigure the woman by outdoing her in speech. But, one might ask, isn't he denying her food and drink, and it turns out, sex? Yes, but only for a short period, and it is clear that he is enduring the same lack of sleep and sex, and possibly food. Moreover, we need to know a bit about falconry. Falcons were prized aristocratic possessions. And we have to understand what a haggard is, that Petruchio imagines himself training to, quote, stoop. There was a major distinction in the falconry literature between a haggard and what was called an eyas. The latter was a bird raised in captivity and useless for hunting. Shakespeare always used the word as a term of contempt. A haggard was a bird captured after it had lived in the wild. Its element of wildness, its spirit, is what made it good for hunting. It was useless without this. And what stooping meant in falconry was not a humble or infirm posture, but a swooping down from a great height on a prey, or, if the bird is trained, to a lure. And ultimately, the falcon had to be fed and loved to be kept. It might, in short, be seen to be in Petruchio's favor that he values Katharina as, quote, a haggard. The scene where Petruchio gets Katharina to say that the sun is the moon and an old man a young girl is easy to assimilate to the world of rope tricks, of rhetoric. Katharina recognizes it as a game and enjoys going along with it, showing off her verbal dexterity and ability, as in the schools, to talk on both sides of a question. This brings me, of course, to what would seem to be the absolute stumbling block, perhaps even more than the haggard and the chattel speeches, to seeing the play as anything other than profoundly committed to male rule and female subservience. And of course, I'm referring to Katharina's final speech. Petruchio really does not know what Katharina is going to do here. In his comic hyperbolic way, he commands her to come to him, to stoop to the lure. But it's clearly up to her how to respond. The two other newly married women, Bianca and a widow, have refused. But Katharina chooses to demonstrate her rhetorical ability. The speech she gives to the other wives is the longest and most elaborate in the play. But what, it will surely and rightly be asked, of the content of the speech? Its major claim is that wives owe their husbands, quote, love, fair looks, and true obedience. Obviously, it's hard to quarrel with the first two, which can easily be seen as reciprocally owed. The sticking point is the third. This seems irredeemably conservative and hierarchical. But we must pause for a moment over what true obedience might mean. Katharina goes on to make a political analogy. Such duty as the subject owes the prince, even such a woman oweth to her husband. And she extends the analogy to the negative case. If a wife is not obedient to her husband's honest will, she is the equivalent of a traitor. But this is not the conservative position. The conservative position was that a subject's obedience to a prince was absolute. Even a tyrant must be unconditionally obeyed. The more radical position held that in general princes should be obeyed, but not in cases where they issued immoral or improper commands. Katharina's speech seems to be clearly in this camp, since she specifies that a wife should be obedient to her husband's honest will. This, as every politically sophisticated member of the audience would have recognized, is a significant limitation on wifely obedience and husbandly command. But what of the argument from female biology, that women should be soft like their bodies? What is apparent to us about this, in our culture of women's workout world, is that it's not a permanent or biologically fixed situation. Would Shakespeare have recognized this? I don't know. Possibly. But it's also important to say that his is not a metaphysically or guaranteed form of inferiority. In the equivalent speech in an Elizabethan play based on Shakespeare's, a play called The Taming of Ashrew, the equivalent speech appeals to the Bible rather than to muscle tone. Ashrew makes use of the famous false etymology that sees woman being derived from the phrase woe of man, pointing thereby in her very essence to her role in the fall of literally man. Shakespeare did not go that route at all. But what can be said about Katharina's final gesture, her offer to place her hand below her husband's foot? Aside from the fact that this does not correspond to any standard gesture of obedience that anyone can find, the point is that she offers to do this. She does not actually do it. The offer is not accepted. Instead, Petruchio issues his final command. Once again, you guessed it, kiss me, Kate. The final line of the play comes back to the issue of transformation. Has Katharina become an entirely different person? The final line suggests that her consent has been vital all along and could not be taken for granted. "'Tis a wonder," says Lucentio, "she will be tamed so." And I agree. And now to that other unpleasant play, The Merchant of Venice. The focus here must, of course, be on the figure of Shylock. His name, which turns out to be an ordinary English one, has entered world culture as a collective rather than a proper noun, a term for a greedy Jewish moneylender, specifically a usurer. We'll have to see to what extent it seems right to think that the play itself is responsible for its Nachleben, its extraordinary afterlife. Now, when you went to see the play in the mid-1590s and realized that you were going to encounter a staged Jew, you, like almost everyone else in the theater, would have had the same question in mind. What will the relation of this play be to the major play about a Jew that you had already seen, perhaps more than once, on the popular stage, namely Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta? In that play, the Jew, ominously and consciously named Barabbas, is a grand merchant, a trader on the largest global scale in luxury items, a figure who revels in his wealth and luxurious possessions. He disdains mere coin and vulgar trade, and is a self-professed and very happy villain. Marlowe has Machiavelli speak the prologue of the play, just to make sure that the audience will not be in any doubt as to Barabbas's values. And there is no doubt as to the point of the play, that there is no difference between Barabbas and the Christian community in which he lives, except that he is better at hypocrisy, manipulation, and wealth accumulation than they are. This equivalence is both dramatized and thematized. Barabbas says of the Christian rulers who have just, as they think, confiscated all his wealth, policy, that's their profession, and not simplicity, as they suggest. And policy was the great Elizabethan term for Machiavellian strategizing, and profession here means faith. So our question in this context is twofold. Does Shakespeare see the Jew as Marlowe does? And does Shakespeare see the Christian community as Marlowe does? The first thing to say about this is that Shakespeare's Jew is not the same as his merchant. Shakespeare, like Marlowe, opens with his merchant, a global trader specializing in luxury items, just like Barabbas. But this is where the similarity ends. We never see Shakespeare's merchant, as we immediately do Marlowe's, reveling in his wealth and felicity. Instead, Shakespeare's play opens with the merchant, Antonio, puzzled at his lack of happiness. We're in a very different territory. The friends with whom Antonio is speaking of his want-wit sadness are certain that they can account for this. His mind, quote, is tossing on the ocean where his ships are, and so are his affections. Surely he cannot think of anything but the possibility of misfortune. Putting himself in Antonio's position, Salerio imagines that when he went to church and saw the holy edifice of stone, he could not help but bethink me straight of dangerous rocks, which, touching but my gentle vessel's side, would scatter all her spices on the stream. Suddenly, we're in the world of obsession. Grand ships are not solid and secure, but delicately vulnerable. But Antonio denies that he suffers from such anxiety. He has multiple ships afloat and other resources in reserve. He also denies that he is in love, a well-known cause of melancholy. In the face of these denials, Solanio and Salerio give up any attempt at explanation, concluding simply that, quote, nature hath framed strange fellows in her time. Two categories of such fellows are cited. Some that will evermore peep through their eyes and laugh like parrots at a bagpiper, and others of such vinegar aspect that they'll not show their teeth in way of smile. The plot begins when the male romantic lead arrives, a young Venetian aristocrat, Bassanio, heavily in debt to Antonio. But in this play, debt, like wealth, is conceived of as profoundly social. Bassanio tells Antonio, "To you I owe the most, in money and in love." Money is only part of it, but it is an essential part of it. Bassanio claims, unconvincingly, to repent his spendthriftness, but his plan to remedy the situation involves a further loan, one that will enable him to maintain a proper port in wooing, like Petruchio, a rich woman, in this case, an heiress. We meet this woman in the second scene, and she too purports to be unaccountably sad, but her lady-in-waiting makes fun of this. Parallel to Bassanio's supposed repentance for his prodigality, Portia knows that she offends against an austere version of Christian ethics. "I know," she says, "it is a sin to be a mocker," but she cannot help being so, any more than Bassanio can reject a swelling port. The cause of her sadness, such as it is entirely situational, not, unlike her indulgence in wit and satire, dispositional. She feels herself bound by her father's will to marry only the man who passes the test prescribed in the will. Shylock enters the play in order to allow Bassanio to enter this competition, since it seems that Antonio was not quite being truthful when he assured Salanio and Salerio that he had wealth in reserve. To furnish Bassanio, Antonio has to find out, quote, "where money is," which means cash on hand. And this brings him to, as the stage direction says, Shylock the Jew. In making his Jew a moneylender rather than a merchant, Shakespeare is flying much closer than Marlowe does to traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes and traditional Jewish roles. In the most traditional and again austere version of Christian ethics, no longer relevant in either Renaissance Italy or Renaissance England, Christians were forbidden to be involved in usury, which was equated with taking any interest at all on a loan. The Deuteronomic commandment saw interest as something that could only be taken from outsiders, not from members of one's community. It divided the world into brothers and others. "Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury." That's the King James Version of Deuteronomy 23:19. But since Christians were supposed to treat everyone as a brother, they could not, as the strict reading went, take interest in any case. So they would have to rely on those who kept the distinction between brothers and others, the Jews. So the other was built into both systems, though somewhat ironically in the Christian case. This austere position was long gone from 16th century Europe, as I've said, especially in commercial centers like Venice or London. But Shakespeare revives it for the play, since the only creditor that we see for whom interest is an issue is the Jew, who's clearly a professional. At first, this figure seems, as one might expect, concerned only with the economic. He wants to understand fully what is being asked of him, and when he says that Antonio is a good man, he does not mean, as Bassanio thinks, that Antonio is virtuous, but that he is good for the money. But when Antonio enters the scene, Shylock suddenly speaks to himself in blank verse and shows some real passion and a depth of involvement with the Venetian business community and with Antonio, with whom he has never done business before, but with whom he has a definite relationship. Suddenly, we are again in the world of motives for feelings. The matter in this case seems simple, and Shylock a mere parody. "I hate him," he says of Antonio, "for he is a Christian." But then there's a more specific reason for this hatred, a business reason, but more, for that in low simplicity he lends out money gratis. And then there's yet another reason. Shylock hates Antonio because Antonio hates Shylock. Antonio hates Jews. He hates our sacred nation. And he calls Shylock a usurer. So Shylock has a whole set of reasons for hating Antonio. Yet, as is always the case in Shakespeare, the multiplication of reasons for an affection, like hatred, tends to make the matter less rather than more clear. Shylock responds to Antonio's boast that he has never until now either lent or borrowed an interest by telling a biblical story. Showing an astonishing capacity for imaginative evocation, Shylock tells the story of how Jacob managed to get a large flock of sheep from his employer Laban by bargaining for the spotted ones and then intervening in, quote, the work of generation, while, quote, the woolly breeders were in the act in order to produce spotted ones. Shylock is fascinated not just with ingenuity, his ostensible point, but also with the mechanics of biology, something that he seems both to loathe and to evoke with almost loving specificity. Antonio dissents from the stress on ingenuity and insists that the production of the spotted sheep was a miracle. He then asks what all this has to do with taking interest. Is your gold and silver ewes and rams? This is one of the great traditional critiques of usury, adopted into Christianity from Aristotle, that it treats an inanimate substance, coins, money, as if it were animate, by making it, as Shylock says, breed. As Ezra Pound, a modern expositor of this view, says, such a phenomenon is, and I'll do the Pound voice, contra naturam, against nature. But one of the interesting things about Shakespeare's play is how very little it dwells on this. Antonio's question is one of the two moments in the play when the motif is voiced. The focus returns from this rather abstract issue to personal relationships. Shylock expands on his third reason for hating Antonio, his third motive. Antonio, he claims, has regularly spit on him and called him a dog, which Antonio readily affirms. So the hatred flows in both directions. Antonio does not wish to see Shylock as part of the Venetian, or perhaps the human, community. But then there is the problem of money. Loans are necessary to merchants, and as Shylock wonderfully asks, hath a dog money? The problem becomes the relation between economics and community. Antonio takes friendship as the defining feature of community. He echoes both the Deuteronomic and the Aristotelian critiques of interest by asking, when did friendship take a breed of barren money from its friend? Christian commentators had shifted the emphasis from strangers to enemies, and Antonio encourages Shylock to lend the money, quote, rather to thine enemy, who, if he break, thou mayst with better face exact the penalty. And here something truly remarkable happens. Shylock decides to take seriously exactly what Antonio has said. He says, in effect, if friendship consists in not taking interest on a loan, I will be your friend by taking, quote, no doit of usance. But Shylock also picks up from Antonio the mention of a penalty in case of forfeit. At this point, Shylock is no longer acting in his professional capacity, which means that usury ceases to be an issue. This is the end of Act 1 of the play. The hard question is what we're to think he has in mind in setting up the no-interest merry bond with the pound of flesh as forfeit. Shakespeare does not have Shylock tell us. Are we to think that Shylock wants to show that he can do what Antonio thinks him incapable of, that is, act as a friend in the specified way? This would certainly serve to refute much of what Antonio thinks about Shylock, forcing Antonio to think of him as inside rather than outside his community. But the question immediately arises, what about the forfeit? Are we to think that Shylock expects to collect it? This seems unlikely, since Antonio has assured him that he expects to be able easily to pay back the loan on time. The Jewish moneylender's pound of flesh bond is part of the source story that Shakespeare is drawing on, a little Italian novella. But Shakespeare has worked to lighten the issue here. It might actually be some sort of weird joke on Shylock's part. But when we next see Shylock in person and at length, it's clear that whatever he had initially intended, the penalty clause is now very much on his mind. His daughter has eloped with one of the Venetian gentlemen of leisure. Salerio and Solanio twit him about this, but also mention a piece of news, that Antonio has lost one of his ships. This obviously raises the question of the forfeit. The gents ask Shylock whether he can possibly be serious about this. He assures them that he is, stressing again Antonio's actions against him, first in a business context and then because I am a Jew. This leads to the speech that is one of the most famous in world literature. One hadn't expected a lesson in ethical universalism and human solidarity from Shylock. And yet, in part, that's what we get. It's not the defense of Jews that one might have expected from a 16th century Philo-Semite, and there were such things. One would have expected an argument from biblical continuity, the same God, the same Bible, up to a point. But this speech comes out of Shylock's extraordinary awareness of biology. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases as a Christian is? There's nothing like this in Marlowe. But, along with biological continuity, comes something else, the matter, again, of affections. The biological bodily continuity creates the high ethical dimension of the speech. The other realm turns the speech in the Marlovian direction. It becomes a justification for revenge, the only affection that the speech mentions. The series of questions about solidarity fall into blank verse rhythm, the speech is in prose, when getting to, and if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? Solidarity is established at the lowest moral rather than the lowest biological denominator. The claim is the Marlovian one, that in seeking revenge, Shylock is, as he says, following Christian example. So now, the Christian community is on trial. And this is how we must read the great trial scene. It turns out that not one of Antonio's vessels has escaped, quote, the dreadful touch of merchant marring rocks. We recall Salario's vision of the vulnerability of gentle vessels to the least touch of stone. The trial scene begins with the Doge, the Duke of Venice, telling Antonio that he faces, quote, a stony adversary. So Shylock is, in the social world, what rocks are in the maritime one. But moving from imagistic to legal details, it's important to see that the fundamental legal premises of the trial scene are that Antonio has in fact defaulted, and that Shylock's contract with Antonio is valid. We are told again and again, once by Antonio himself, that the commercial life of Venice depends on the strict enforcement of contracts, regardless of the ethnic or religious identities of the parties. The validity of the contract, on the face of it, is never an issue in the proceeding. The only question is whether Shylock can collect his forfeit. This means that the arguments made to him can only be appeals either to his good nature or to some principle beyond legality. Shylock insists on his forfeit. But he knows that he will be asked why he wants this, especially since, even at this point, he can apparently receive his money back. This would seem to be the perfect opportunity for Shylock to enumerate the reasons he has for hating Antonio. He has the highest possible public audience for his grievances. And yet he chooses to answer the why question by not doing so. He appeals to the invulnerability of sheer willfulness in relation to legal use of one's property. Say it is my humor, he asserts, and gives an example. What if my house were troubled by a rat, and I be pleased to give 10,000 ducats to have it baned? The idea clearly is that this may be crazy, but that no one could contest his perfect right to do it. But then he goes on to cite a number of cases that fall into a different category of non-negotiable behavior. The world of affections, initially presented as a mystery, is now seen as even more so. Affection is seen as master of passion. Whatever one is instinctively repelled or attracted by brings the associated feelings with it. Shylock recapitulates the cases he has cited: people who can't stand a gaping pig, people who go mad if they behold a cat, and, most weirdly and strikingly, those who, quote, when the bagpipe sings in the nose, cannot contain their urine. And he insists on the total irrationality of these cases, as there is no firm reason to be rendered why he cannot abide a gaping pig, why he, a harmless necessary cat, why he, a woolen bagpipe, but of force, must yield himself to such inevitable shame as to offend himself being offended. So can I give no reason, nor I will not, more than a lodged hate and a certain loathing I bear Antonio, that I follow thus a losing suit against him. We are back to the world of nature hath framed strange fellows in her time, where the bagpipe was first seen as provoking an automatic response, making some fellows laugh uncontrollably. Shylock is willing to equate himself with the helpless, disgusting, and self-disgusted urinator in order to explain, or not explain, his behavior toward Antonio. This is the culmination of his fascination with, we can now say, mechanical biological processes. Recall the copulating ewes, as well as do we not bleed. Lodged hate, and more so, a certain loathing, are meant to capture the irrationality of this affection and its operation way below the realm of normal motives. But of course, there's more to be said. He does defend his actions, not only as beyond or beneath negotiation, but also as rightful. Now he leaves the issue of motive, so to speak, behind, and moves to that of rights. He insists on the absoluteness of property rights. But, one might say, surely there is no such thing as the absolute right over another person's body. Shylock refutes this by pointing to slavery in Venetian society, which turns out to be historically true. So here Shakespeare goes the Marlovian route in a more devastatingly historical way. The Society of Christian Slaveholders hardly seems to be in a position, legally or morally, to rebuke Shylock. This speech is never answered. The announcement that Bellario is on his way intervenes. Shylock denies that Mercy must have some hold on him, and Portia, disguised as Bellario, gives her famous and apparently quite pointless speech on mercy needing to be given and being admirable in monarchs. Shylock is offered twice and then 3 times his money, but we already know that his motive, such as it is not monetary. At this point, Portia springs the drop of blood trick. This is in the source text, where after being defeated of his forfeit and denied any money at all, the Jew simply tears up the bond and runs off in a rage. But Shakespeare invents a second law, one that concerns an alien conspiring against a citizen. A drop of Christian blood has already foretold this. Under this law, Shylock loses all his property, half to the state and half to the citizen in question, and is subject to execution by the Duke. Bassanio's wooing companion urges execution, but the Duke presents himself as a moral example. Portia knew to whom she was addressing her speech. This is supposed to be a major anti-Marlovian moment. The Christian community, at its best, is morally superior. The Duke tells Shylock, that thou shalt see the difference in our spirit. I pardon thee thy life before thou ask it. But interestingly, Shylock is not impressed. He points out that it is not clearly better to be reduced to poverty than to die, and that they have basically condemned him to social death. You take my life when you do take the means by which I live. But Christian mercy is not finished with Shylock. Antonio steps in with his offer to give up one half of Shylock's goods in order to have the other half, presumably the state's half, in use, whatever this now means, and to insist that Shylock both immediately convert to Christianity and also give up entirely the right to dispose of all assets that he may have when he dies, signing them over in advance to, quote, the gentleman that lately stole his daughter. Shylock agrees and promises to sign the legal instrument that will be created, one that is ironically called a deed of gift. So, where does this leave the matter of answering Marlowe? It is certain that Shylock, once he is designated as an alien, could have been executed. But as we have seen, it's not clear that sparing him this is to be reckoned as enormously benevolent. In being deprived of his religion, much of his estate, and his right to control his estate, he is being subjected to something like social death. It is hard to imagine that he'll be a welcome member of the Christian community after his enforced conversion. And the pleasure of seeing him out-legalized by the spokesperson for mercy is at least a complex one for the thoughtful spectator, someone more morally aware than Bassanio's jeering friend with the ironic name of Gratiano. Moreover, the sudden declaring of him as an alien, when it seems as if he did have a definite and long-standing, if controversial, role in the community, is quite shocking. Nor was enforced conversion universally seen as benevolent or meaningful. In summary, it looks as if Shakespeare wanted the Christian community to be more attractive than it is in Marlowe's play, and he did want Bassanio and Portia and company to be mostly attractive characters. But they do seem to founder on the rock of the Jew. And what, last paragraph, and what, finally, of Shylock himself? His role as a usurer disappears early in the play. Whatever it is that he values is not a matter of economics. He is, as we have seen, most striking as a spokesman for the power of unconscious motivation, not for calculation. And Shakespeare has suggested how biology can be used as a basis for community. The question of what a well-treated Shylock would look like is a very interesting one. Unlike in The Taming of the Shrew, however, we do not get, in this case, even an intimation of what treating the alien well would provide. Thank you.